Everybody. Thanks for attending today's webinar. My name is Marie Abernathy, and I'm the brand lead at Carbon Solutions. Throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, go ahead and just post them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. Today, we have Erin Middleton presenting on the community benefits within carbon capture and how those benefits pertain to environmental justice. Erin is the Director of Energy Equity at Carbon Solutions. She is passionate about helping stakeholders make informed decisions about which low-carbon energy technologies make sense for their communities while meeting local, state, and federal climate goals. She provides technical and analytical support for community benefits plans, environmental and energy justice, geological carbon sequestration, and hydrogen. Prior to Carbon Solutions, Erin's work has integrated a variety of disciplines and methodological approaches, including population geography, program evaluation, strategic planning, climate surveys within educational settings, tribal engagement, family engagement, qualitative and quantitative evaluation of student test scores, and survey development and evaluation. She received her undergraduate degree from Purdue in environmental geoscience and a master's and PhD from geography from UC Santa Barbara. Now I'll hand it off to Erin.
Thanks, Marie. I'm happy to be here today. I'm going to be presenting community benefits and carbon capture. Can you measure environmental justice? I want to start out with a definition. There are many definitions of environmental justice, and I might even go over a couple of different ones today. But just to level set, the definition of environmental justice I'm going to begin with is from the EPA. I'm actually going to read it to highlight some of the things that are especially important. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement, so those are two things that we can begin to quantify, of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This goal will be achieved when everybody has the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and has equal access to the decision-making process for a healthy environment to live, learn, and work. The reason that I'm starting with this is sometimes we want environmental justice to be something different than this. We would like there to be some distribution of benefits to folks. We would like there to be more equal access to be able to enjoy the environment or to stop risks. Some of those things are in here, but some of these things are not. The other reason this definition is important is much of our work at Carbon Solutions involves responding to state, federal, or local grants. And when environmental justice has a different definition across many different agencies, it can be difficult to measure what environmental justice is. Many of the things that we're called on to do then in measuring environmental justice is having some common definition, and this is one of the definitions that we're going to be using as we go forward in our work. The reason for this, there's a long history of environmental risks, hazards, environmental racism. I'm not going to cover any of this work here, but some of examples that we can see of challenges that we face can be seen here in the EPA Environmental Justice Screening Tool. This tool is still live. There have been a preponderance of other tools that have come up in the recent times, but this one shows some important information. What I'd like you to see right now is I've highlighted in turquoise one of the block groups here. And what the EJ Screen tool has is several measures that are saying what percentile folks who live in that area experience various environmental issues. One of them is particulate matter that's of a certain size, 2.5, ozone, diesel particulate matter, carbon or cancer risk, traffic proximity. There are several metrics that the EJ Screening tool came up with that said, how are folks doing? How can we see it in one area? And where are areas of particular risk? the reason that I want to highlight this is one of the difficulties that we have in encountering or measuring environmental justice now is we have to have some baseline of what concerns there are. We are not starting with a clean slate. If we wanted to go in and do a carbon capture project, it isn't as if every single location in the entire country has no history or legacy of environmental justice or injustice issues. Some of the things that we face are highlighted here. There's legacy pollution, there's housing segregation, there's urban and rural divides, there's already existing infrastructure that makes some places better to locate things in one place than another. There are different local, regional, and state requirements, and there's unequal access to information and power. And the reason that I'm putting all of these things together is there are some very physical things that we can measure, such as a particulate matter. There's other things that are more difficult to measure, such as the legacy of housing segregation in our communities. The goal of environmental justice is to integrate some of these more qualitative measures with some of the quantitative measures in order to determine a better way forward as we transition into some of the technologies for decarbonization, such as carbon capture and storage. So some of this work is highlighting what has happened so far so that we can move to a different place. But it means that we need to be able to have information to show where we are starting right now. Another thing that I want to highlight is this Justice 40 timeline. So in the last slide, we showed where we were or where we are right now. And so the question now is, what the heck can we begin to do? What can we do about it? This shows some things that are key dates, mostly because they especially impacted those of us who were responding to federal opportunity announcements, federal grants. One interesting thing that has happened in the last couple of years is in codifying environmental justice, there are new requirements that are requiring researchers, industrial partners, other folks to start replying in grants to how they are very specifically going to do environmental justice. So we've gone from here are this list of things that you need to consider or concerns that you have to now you need to actually do something to change some of those numbers that we saw in the previous slide. The first one is in January 2021, President Biden issued an executive order for Justice 40. This is saying that 40% of project benefits, of some project benefits, need to flow to disadvantaged communities. Everything that I just said there now suddenly needed to be measured. We needed to be able to say which programs, which 40%, which communities. And many of the other things on these timelines are steps along the way to help us be able to measure some of these things. The other things that I want to highlight especially are in July and August. One of the programs, one of the 21 federal pilot programs that were announced included carbon capture. So suddenly, for those of us that were applying for things relative to carbon sequestration, there were updates of things that we needed to do. We needed to write community engagement plans. We needed to look at additional data sources that started to highlight which communities were Justice 40 communities. We needed to start considering environmental justice risks and benefits in every one of the proposals that we were responding to. And now that these are funded, proposals that we will actually need to report about. Some of these other things are not less important, but they are showing what I want you to see is that there has been very regular updates and progress from the White House in terms of how to move Justice 40 forward. The last box that I would like you to see in gray is where we are right now. So I did not put a link in this, but if you want to Google the Environmental Justice Scorecard, you'll be able to see every single agency with a scorecard that the CEQ has released articulating where they have come over this period of time in addressing some environmental justice issues. So we're at this point right now where we have gone from having some legislation, giving some things that they say that we have to do, to actually beginning to say, here's these list of responses that you need, to now the agency saying, and here's what we have begun to do. And we'll be seeing this in many more projects going forward. One of the things that's difficult about environmental justice to me is to make environmental justice better, you really need to say which ways we're already struggling with what is environmental justice or how we got where we are now, and then figure out what steps along the path you can take in order to make this better. There are four, in much of the social science research around environmental justice, there are three aspects that people have highlighted as barriers to increasing justice. This is recognition justice, which acknowledges historical and present bias for inequities. Procedural justice, which is saying that even if we had this process, even if we knew where the issues for historical legacies were, there is no procedure for people to engage in promoting their concerns as a project go forwards. There's distributional justice, which is to say, even if we know where these problems are and there's a procedure for going forward, who bears the risks and who gets to enjoy the benefits of a project that goes forward. So in this case, distributional justice is really saying these risks and benefits are located somewhere in space and occur to communities. How can we begin to articulate this? And there's a fourth area that is more exploratory, I'd say right now, but is often the place where environmental justice advocates focus most of their work, which is restorative justice. In this case, we have the system right now. How the heck can we make it better? And the reason that I like to consider aspects of environmental justice in this way is it gives us a way to actually begin to measure things. Are we even having a way that we can recognize where injustices have happened or not? Is there a procedure? What is the procedure for allowing folks to comment on what's happening, and how can we make sure that it's an equitable system? How are we measuring the risks and the benefits that are distributed across space? And then finally, where can we begin to change not just these three things of participation and distribution, but change the system, which again is what many environmental justice organizations are looking for. The other reason that I like to articulate it this way is it allows folks an entry point to discuss what the concerns are. So if we're talking about environmental justice, it may feel like people aren't going far enough, but it allows us to at least have a discussion to say, you're looking at restorative practices, and we're only looking at recognition in this part. How can we begin to come together to talk about the same thing? So I think it can be a helpful framework for involving other people in decision-making processes. One of the ways that we have begun to look at this, or the Department of Energy has begun to look at this, is actually saying, okay, if we're going to look at this, we need to actually recognize where there are issues. So what you can see here are there are a million different environmental justice indices that have happened, but there are some that our team really likes in order to have a balance of different approaches for defining environmental justice. The first one is the DOE Disadvantaged Community Reporter. A second one is the Climate and Economic Justice Tool. And a final one is the CDC's Social and Vulnerability Index. The reason I'm highlighting these is if we have these four things that we're trying to begin to articulate, one of the first steps and one of the places where people have made the most inroads is beginning to quantify recognizing those areas, especially, let's say, by census tracts, that have more burdens than other areas. And so this was a first approach. Some of these have been around for quite a while, like the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. Some of them were around for another period of time, such as the EPA EJ Screen tool, and they are the Disadvantaged Community Reporter and the CEQ's Climate CJUST tool are able to combine these information in different ways in order to account for both the legacy of pollution in addition to social factors that are coming together that are making folks that are able to show which communities may be at risk of not having environmental justice. What I want you to see from this map, however, even if you just look at the colors, is that many of these metrics are measuring very different things. There are some communities that are facing every one of the issues that or are environmental justice communities according to every single one of these, and some of them that are not. This makes it especially important to use a range of tools because some communities may have some concerns that are of a different concern to a different community, and giving communities voice to articulate what those concerns are is especially important in environmental justice. Another thing that I want to show you is, this is from Bloomberg Law and Government, but not only are there federal definitions, but these are states. This is a slightly older data, although not many have formally approved of environmental justice laws yet. But imagine what we just saw, and then imagine every state having their own definitions of each one of these things too. So the interesting thing for those of us who are working in an environmental justice space is, now we have recognition that this is an issue, but the amount of data for defining who is or is not an environmental justice community has frankly exploded. So keeping these things in mind, if you're working in any particular location, it's important to keep in mind not only the federal definitions, but that every state that you're working in, and in some case municipality, county, or region, may have their own environmental justice definitions as well, and integrating those into one kind of system will be especially important in talking to stakeholders, especially if those stakeholders spent a lot of time in working on their state's own definitions of environmental justice. So from the previous two things, we have gotten to a point where we are thinking a lot about what recognition is. And I'm not going to say that recognition is done, but I am going to say that that is probably where the most efforts have happened. One of the concerns that is where the space where we are now is thinking about how can we bring in environmental justice as we go through procedures? How can people have a voice in what's happening in their communities? These are a compilation of things that you can start to think of as you're working with communities. But I think that given some of the federal grants right now, the onus is really on projects. This is not new. This is never happened before. But the amount of engagement, the number of people that should be involved, and the length of engagement with communities and having a transparent procedure in interacting with communities is unprecedented for the number of federal projects there have been. And this is finding in many different ways. So who should you be talking to? You should not just be talking to the Chamber of Commerce. You should not just be talking to industrial partners. Really, it's all of these groups: trade schools, community colleges, chambers of commerces, workforce development programs, faith groups, labor groups, tribal governments, universities, community colleges. The goal is to have many points of interaction with a community for those that have traditionally had access with power or to power, and to those to make an additional effort to those that have not traditionally had access to power. One of the ways that this can happen is by how you engage with communities. So it is not enough to put an advertisement in the paper or have one community meeting at a monthly county government meeting. Really, the what of what you do are a whole bunch of different things: outreach to community groups, focus groups, brainstorming, go to transportation fairs, go to workforce development fairs. The idea for community engagement is that to reach as many people as you can by going to the site of where people are already engaging in their communities, which may look very different than one person doing a PowerPoint presentation to a Rotary Club in town, for example. Another thing with procedural justice that is happening in the federal grant space is that you should have a process for engaging community, not just at the end of the project or not just at the beginning of the project, but it should be early, often, and ongoing. So at the beginning of the project, during the projects, at the project completion, and for carbon sequestration, it's especially important for this to last for the duration of the project being monitored. This can be for much longer than after the time when folks have left. So really having a plan that is able to articulate concerns over a much larger period of time. This also means that you need to go to where people are: phone, webinars, texting, websites, job fairs, town halls, in order for more people to be able to speak to their experiences and to understand what's happening, especially in these technologies that are so new. There needs to be a focus on reaching people both where they are physically and in a way that they can understand. So procedural justice is considering all of these things, and quite frankly, in many of the projects we're on, having staff to be able to have this as a job. This should no longer be an afterthought. This should be have a dedicated person to champion procedural justice throughout the projects. Another thing that I want to show in terms of thinking about justice is where should, how do we distribute risks and benefits for in the case of environmental justice? One of the products that we have is SimCCS. What I want you to see here, however, are the blue dots are sources. These are industrial sources that would be places where you would have capture equipment. The sinks are in green, and this is the idea of where there are good geology for sequestration sites. And the pipelines, this is real data, but not something that's being planned right now. The pipeline is showing where you would need to, where are potential routes in order to match the sources to the sinks. And I think one of the critical things for me that is difficult for, especially answering some of the federal opportunity announcements, has been you can do community outreach for just the carbon sequestration piece. There are other grants that look at community outreach for just the pipeline piece. There are other grants that will look at just the carbon capture piece. And at Carbon Solutions, we really think of this as the entire ecosystem that supports carbon sequestration. And I am showing this here to show that if we're talking about the distribution of risks and benefits, you can't have carbon sequestration in one place and not think about the upstream impacts of where CO2 is being collected and the routing that it's going through. And this is especially important when you're able to articulate potential risks and benefits of the system. Here, this matches the colors that we were looking at in the beginning part. And in this case, we can have at the sources potential risks and benefits or reductions of CO2, installation of equipment, reductions in co-pollutants, and jobs. You can see along the pipeline and route some of the concerns that we may have, maybe leaks or construction, and then risks to many different areas, either environmental areas or climate sensitive areas or social science or socially at-risk population areas. For example, near schools, pipeline routes you may want to have in different places because of proximity near to sensitive populations. At the sink and sequestration site, there are other concerns that you can see here. Many of them involve leakage or concern about water quality. There are some concerns about induced seismicity, and there can also be construction-related activities. The reason that I think it's important to think about each one of these is because you can then begin to articulate goals related to risks and benefits at not only the sequestration site, but also along the pipeline corridor or at the source, because this is an entire ecosystem that supports carbon sequestration. So I've gone through some of the approaches to thinking about environmental justice: recognition, procedural, distributive, and restorative. And one of the ways that I think we can begin to start measuring this is coming up with a goal and then coming up with a metric to measure this. You can read some of these here, but the idea for me is it is not enough. There's two things. Number one, it's very difficult to say that to have an end goal of restorative justice. And so it is not that each one of these are stepwise feeding into one another, but it is true that first you at least have to recognize what populations are having the biggest at-risk populations and have communities themselves be able to define these. At the point that you're able to understand where folks are, you can begin to say, okay, how can I come up with procedures to reach the folks in these communities or in all communities so that I can begin to hear where concerns are and understand if I need different languages or different ways of communicating. Is there a difficulty with broadband, for example? Then you shouldn't have webinars. But first recognizing where people are and then having procedures that are able to integrate where folks are and the resources they have available to them to completely participate in a process of looking at a project is important. At that point, you can begin with looking at having the right recognition and having procedures in place for impact. You can begin to actually think about how you could distribute risks and benefits. Without doing those things, it is very easy to come up with a system to say, we need water management, or we need more jobs, or we need more housing, without having the input of communities. And so it's really building on this recognition procedural before you can get to the distributive idea of where are the needs of the community. And then here are some ways that you could measure this. For example, transparent monitoring approach in order to look for project risks, or promoting local hiring. But it is really, really based on doing good work in the first two steps. If one is able to get these things done, I think it is possible to move to restorative justice concepts. In this case, these are the things that many of us would like to do: minimizing burdens to all community members, and minimizing unnecessary or redundant construction. But in order to do this, it really takes much bigger system-wide changes. For example, working with engineers on well construction in order to make sure that the materials that we use are the best in terms of avoiding leakages, or wanting to minimize redundant construction by adopting regional carbon management plans. First, people have to know that they need carbon management plans, and we need to know that that's the concern in the area, at which point we can start moving into restorative justice and actually beginning measuring some of these things. The thing that I would like to do in a short conclusion is to think about where we are now. In the last 2 years, there has just been an amazing amount of work in getting people to think about environmental justice. We do a lot of market research interviews, and one person said at the end of all of these market research interviews, everybody's heard of Justice 40, but nobody knows what to do with it. I articulated on the last slide some beginning steps that we can make as we're getting funded for some of these projects of what we can do with this. But I think another exciting thing that is happening is investment in environmental justice and community benefits groups. The technical assistance centers, that $117 million were announced. This is a note from their website showing where these are located. We have tools. We have so many tools. We have so much data. The point that we are now is getting to having those tools and the data in the right people's hands in order to actually begin enacting some of the ideas that we've been thinking of. This is especially true, as I mentioned earlier, with state, federal agencies, and communities each having their own definitions. That is a lot of different arrows that you may have going in different directions that you're trying to maximize. So having somebody who's able to provide the technical assistance to communities to be able to even understand some of these things is going to be extremely important. A lot of these technologies are new, and they are nuanced as they're getting deployed, and having support from either nonprofits or governments or technical assistance in some way will be critical in order to getting people to access the data that they need. So what I'd like to talk about for this last slide is what are some of the challenges that we have faced. So I've mentioned there's an explosion of federal projects, but there's a lot of issues with this. There are a few places in the country, many of you may live in there. One of them is almost anywhere in Louisiana, some places around Chicago. Wyoming has a lot of work. There are certain places where there is a lot of federal money going, and I believe that the onus is on us to avoid burnout and overwhelm for communities. It's true that communities should have engagement, but it's also true that not every community should have to make every single decision. It would be wonderful if there were enough policies, protections, this is where the environmental justice comes in, and monitoring in place, that instead of watching every single thing that happens, communities are able to put faith in the system of policy and regulations, that things are going as they should. The other thing that's important for procedure is that there's a real difference between pilot studies and actual deployment. And one of the stressors is, how do you tell people this may go nowhere in a year versus this is an actual 10-year project that you will see have jobs? And that's another tension that we're having with some of the in acting procedural justice. Another thing is pilot projects are having a lot of technical uncertainties. So if you are going to have a process where you are allowing communities to come in and learn about what's happening, having a great way of conveying uncertainty to communities is extremely important. Having the idea that things may change as the project goes on, and having enough trust in both the communities and the people who are running the projects to be able to work together is extremely important. In addition to this, who is monitoring this work? Are there state folks? Are there local folks? Do the communities have faith in the state and local folks that are monitoring this work? Is it possible to work together with community colleges or someone who's going to be in the community for a longer period of time? All of those things are important for for environmental justice from a procedural lens. Another one is distributive challenges. Sharing best practices for emerging projects is very difficult. So one of the questions is, how can you transfer the best that's happening in terms of risks and benefits to other projects? How can you make sure that in some states like California that have very high amount of regulations and oversight is being transferred to other states that may be farther down, may not have as developed laws, so that the environmental justice is not replicating the concerns as it has developed so far, but is actually spreading some of the new things that have happened into new sites as they're being built, and not 10 years from now when the regulations may be in place in a different state. Another distribution challenge is tracking outcomes. If we're doing great work in jobs in one place because they worked with a workforce development center, how can we begin in another place without a workforce development center to have similar outcomes? Do you need to spend time in developing a workforce development center first, or work with the state to do some of those kinds of things? How can you track them? How can you measure them? And who's responsible for making sure that things are happening as as projects say that they will? I think the restorative challenges are how can you make system-wide changes? And I feel like this is the place where we are right now. Many of us who are operating in this space, it's really exciting to be able to do cross-state or regional collaborations, because we can begin to see where the best practices are and hopefully spread them to other locations. This is especially true, as I mentioned previously, in local state approaches to environmental justice. If one state has environmental justice legislation and is doing an amazing job having procedures and recognizing who needs to be involved and even tracking distribution, and another state has absolutely nothing, how can we overcome those gaps? And how can we ensure that the projects that are being started in places with less legislation are not going to replicate the difficulties that may exist in terms of environmental justice in those places right now? The final challenge that I would have is data. I am amazed by the amount of data that people have been able to pull together for tract. I know a lot of people, I know that it is not the level that most people would like, but to have federal databases with so much information is amazing. The hard part, however, is one of them is the geographic availability of where these are, as in sometimes you would like block groups or data covering smaller population areas that doesn't exist, and we have tracts or counties or sometimes only statewide data. But the other difficulty with this is how can we collect data but also protect privacy, which is why some of this isn't available at different geographies. So if we really want an energy system, for example, one of the concerns with carbon sequestration is that it's going to add cost to the system. How can we ensure that if costs are added to the system, that there aren't more electricity shutoffs, that there is not an unfair burden of low-income populations bearing more than their share of the utility increases? How can we ensure that utilities, in some cases, if we're talking about carbon capture at utilities, are good actors across their entire area as opposed to putting cost in one place more than the other? How can we collect data on some of that information, or even say childhood asthma or things that are of concern for health outcomes? How can we collect the data that we need while protecting privacy? And I think that that is one of the major challenges of restorative justice. Even if we're doing a great job, how can we prove that we're doing a great job? And I think in order to do this, one of the big challenges is at the beginning of the project, Make sure that you have these kind of outcomes mapped out so that collecting data and evaluating data is a part of the entire part of the project, not something that you're thinking of at the very end. This ends my slides, and I appreciate everybody listening.
The question is, how do you work on building trust in communities you engage with?
I think it's really hard. I don't have a great answer for this, but I do think that one of the things that we're seeing that is, I'm not going to say most troublesome, but difficult, given the number of projects that are happening in certain locations right now, is that there are literally not enough people doing engagement to be able to work with communities. I think that one of the things that has happened in federal listening tours of coal communities, in almost any stakeholder engagement feedback form that I have seen, is that having project staff, those who are actually going to do the project, be in the community over a period of time in order to listen to them is one of the best ways to build trust. It's not that that's a silver bullet by any means, but I think one of the things that's been most interesting to me in working in multiple states around carbon sequestration is how often some community-owned utilities or people who have to slog through community engagement all of the time have great practices in this. The concern that I have is many of the people that are operating in the energy space now are kind of brand new and don't have the community connections that have happened before. I think that the best thing to do is to try to get folks on the ground talking to people as soon as you can, and to have a plan for long-term engagement with the community as opposed to just going in there immediately. I know it isn't always possible, and I think that this is especially difficult with some of the pilot projects that are happening, because people can kind of go into a community and it's true that they may be out pretty quickly. But the biggest trust seems to be with having frequent, authentic engagement with community members over a long period of time.
Right? I guess thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate it, and we'll link this webinar on our YouTube and on our social channels. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you all so much.